you might have in mind in regard to Ron's comments, and we'll take them up. So I'm happy then to introduce our last speaker of the day. Professor Michael Zimmerman is chair and professor of philosophy at Tulane University. He is the co-director of Tulane's Environmental Studies program. He wears many hats. He's also a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry. So after these sessions, if any of you have any issues you would like to take up with Professor Zimmerman. His monographs include Contesting Earth's Future, Radical Ecology and Postmodernity, and his forthcoming book, Integral Ecology. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very, very pleased and proud to be here. It's a privilege to be associated with this event. People who are speaking with me and the organizers, Donald and Daniel and Larry. And I want to also thank Rebecca and Susan for their help, and also for our tech staff who are working under difficult operating conditions. Now, I'm just going to go straight to the question, since you all have done such a great job of. No, I can't get away with that, I guess. All right. So I'll go ahead and give you my remarks. Having wrapped themselves for decades in the mantle of the natural sciences in order to gain credibility with political and managerial establishment leaders, some environmentalists concede that this strategy involves a serious problem. While valuing the natural world highly and calling on others to join them in protecting it, environmentalists typically subscribe to a naturalistic materialism that either excludes value altogether or else regards it sociobiologically as an adaptive strategy useful for enhancing the survival chances for a certain species. For such naturalism, all phenomena are assumed to have only exterior aspects that can be analyzed wholly in third-person terms, that is, as its. In a world comprised of its, there is no place for me, you, us, that is, to the first and second-person perspectives. The interior domains that comprise aesthetic experience, morality, consciousness, subjectivity, freedom, value, intersubjectivity, and culture, considered in their own terms. Naturalism maintains that for something to be means for it to be a phenomenon analyzable without remainder. I want to emphasize that. Either into its externally observable parts and behaviors, or else into its functions within an externally observable system. From the perspective according to which there are only its, including human its, all talk of interiority is naive, retrograde, and misguided. So-called interior phenomena are topics for folk psychological discourse, which is not taken seriously by scientists who understand what is really going on. Folk psychology stands to contemporary cognitive science as false consciousness once stood to Soviet Marxism. Many environmentalists conclude that contemporary environmental problems often arise from anthropocentrism, according to which human rationality, consciousness, subjectivity, and moral capacity justify human domination of non-human beings. For such environmentalists, naturalism has worked against anthropocentrism, not only by denying that humans are the culmination of evolutionary purpose, for there is no such purpose, but also by eliminating the entire domain of interiority, with which subjectivity, spirituality, consciousness, and culture are associated. By pulling the rug out from human arrogance, environmentalists hope to save natural habitat from destruction. Ending cosmic hierarchy displaces humankind from its throne atop the tree of life, for there is no such tree. Instead, life is a bush with many branches, no one of which is privileged, none higher than the others. In support of what some deep ecologists call radical biocentric egalitarianism, other anti-hierarchical environmentalists adopted the language of systems theory, according to which all phenomena are merely strands in the great cosmic web. In this web, humans have no special status vis-a-vis plants, animals, or physical habitat. Instead, humans are merely one species among others striving to enhance their reproductive advantage over against their competitors. Read sociobiologically, concepts such as rights and values are merely useful fictions bestowing a measure of justification to nature-dominating practices aimed at enhancing the power of humankind over other life forms. In view of all this and more, much more, environmental ethics seems not only impossible, but worse, it's an embarrassment to the scientifically sophisticated. So perhaps we should just get on with the business of serving the biological imperative at work within us, namely turning the entire planet into a manageable and hopefully sustainable habitat suitable for supporting an ever-expanding human population. Now, neither biologists nor naturalistic and environmentalists would offer a moral critique of non-human species that maximize their reproduction. Even population crash and extinction may result if a species were to population crash and extinction may result if a species were to overshoot its carrying capacity. But there would be no moral failing involved. For the human animal, too, only a prudential ought can be recommended. We ought to alter our behavior toward the non-human domains only if we wish to promote long-term human survival. Yet many environmentalists insist that a moral ought to apply here. We ought to limit our behavior, including our own reproductive drive, so that other life forms can survive and prosper. The often tacit presupposition that only humans are morally responsible for their behavior conflicts with naturalism, which has difficulty accounting for morality, values, and the ought in their own terms, along with the other interior domains to which access cannot be gained by the third-person methods employed by the natural and social sciences, methods that work terrifically in other realms. Now, for those who are unsatisfied with the paradoxical situation in which environmental ethics is undermined by the naturalism favored by environmentalists, there are some alternatives. One is the work of Holmes Rolston III, which I admire. His work I admire very much. Another is a work developed by Ken Wilber, known as Integral Theory, according to which the cosmos may be regarded as a nested hierarchy, or holarchy, he calls it, whose constituents can be described in terms of multiple perspectives, including those involving the third person, and this is a point of view adopted by the social and natural sciences. The second person, this is the point of view adopted by the humanities. And the first person, the domain of phenomenology, aesthetics, and the fine arts. But Wilber insists that however successful the methods of the natural and social sciences may be, and they have been tremendously successful, these methods pertain only to third-person phenomena, that is, to objects. Without interiority, objects lack the capacity, however meager, to constitute a perspective of their own within which to regard or to take into account other things. So by restoring an appropriate position for interiority to the cosmos, we can solve two related problems. First is the widespread modern sense that self-aware humankind is a freaky accident in a completely meaningless material universe within which there is really no place for awareness of any sort. We got into this in philosophy about 10 years ago when there were a flurry of articles written about zombieism. You know, what does consciousness add to being human? It's unclear why it's even needed. Could we not just be regarded from the outside as the sum of our behaviors? There's no real need for adding the fact that you're sitting there in your seat having a first-person experience. Alienated from body, emotion, nature, and even consciousness, the abstract human ego sets out to know and control the material world that seems simultaneously very real and yet wholly other. Now, the second problem is a widespread eco-romantic conviction that only by renouncing mind, consciousness, rationality, and other allegedly alienating features of human consciousness, and only by reabsorbing ourselves within the patterns of nature, that is, only by scraping off the sorry accretions imposed by 10,000 years of civilization, can humankind regain its lost unity with Mother Nature. Despite important differences, both the modern abstract ego and the modern eco-romantic share something in common, a kind of one-dimensional ontology, according to which the only things that exist are the surfaces or exterior aspects of things as they appear in terms of a third-person perspective. But Wilber maintains that interiority is a basic feature of reality, every bit as real in its own way as matter, energy, space, or time. David Chalmers, a very well-known contemporary philosophy of mind, represents this position, which is a basis for a kind of panpsychism, with which I have a lot of affinity and which is, in a sense, a theoretical framework for what traditional societies have appreciated as the animistic aspect of all phenomena, that they are all somehow ensouled. From this point of view, would be that they all have the capacity for taking a perspective. Now, what would happen to our conception of terrestrial nature at many different scales if researchers assume that the phenomena they study, including animals and plants and more, had an interior aspect that would have to be taken into account in order fully to characterize the phenomenon in question. How would the sciences of ecology have to change? Indeed, how would environmentalism have to change, perhaps especially with regard to its troubled relationships with human beings, who are endowed with an extensive linguistically enhanced mode of subjectivity? Now, the loss of interiority, or I should say the loss of credibility of the interior domains, began 300 years ago with a movement away from the ascent tradition in the Middle Ages, which encouraged people to aspire to have the soul return to God, and there was a concomitant discounting of the material world, and the rise of the descent tradition, in which moderns emphasize that only by transforming the earth and by transforming human institutions could we develop the kind of well-being that was promised by religion in heaven. So the descent program of modernity denied the path of ascent, which ascribed to the belief that there are interior domains that cannot be discerned by the eye of flesh, or else reconceived it as the endless horizontal movement of economic and scientific development. In attempting to open up a free space for science, economics, politics, philosophy, and art, moderns ended up throwing out the spiritual baby with the bathwater. So Wilber argues that the battle between ascenders and descenders is the central and defining conflict in the Western mind. Let me move on to, having to leave out a lot of stuff. And of course, everything that you have a question about or think that should have been included is included in what I'm leaving out here. So. Now, following Max Weber and Habermas, who based their distinctions on Kant's three critiques, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment, Habermas and Weber and Wilber divide the domains of reality into three major domains. The domain studied by the natural and social sciences, the first-person domain, the domain of aesthetics and fine arts and first-person experience, and the domain of the intersubjective domain of culture. Now, differentiating these domains is a tremendous achievement of modernity. It's what distinguishes modernity from pre-modern cultures. It means you don't have the church telling scientists what to do. And it means you don't have politics run out of the backyard of priests and so on. It opens up free space for different modes of activity, inquiry, and self-expression. But these domains were not successfully integrated. They flew apart to some extent. And one of these domains, one of these perspectives, the natural science and the social science perspective, the its third-person its perspective, pretty much triumphed. So we have today, this is one reason we're having this conference, it's the third-person perspective, these powerful methods employed by the natural and social sciences, which have been the primary ways in which we've understood environmental problems in our relationship to nature. There's absolutely no way that we should do anything but include and applaud these perspectives, but they're not enough. These other two perspectives, the first and second-person perspectives, need to be restored. Now, the modern ego sought to disenchant nature, both to eliminate any lingering concerns about violating Mother Nature and to achieve the ideal of moral and rational objectivity. So long as one's moral reasoning process are influenced by biological factors, emotions, so long as one's moral judgments are tainted by personal, familial, tribal, or racial factors, one is not truly rational, impartial, and thus fully human. So following Kant, the modern ego sought to transcend the domain of particularity and corporeality to become universal and impartial. But this quest had major problems. First, moderns could not really admit to a domain transcending the material plane. In other words, if it's all just a bunch of matter following the laws of motion, what is the status of the ego, of consciousness? Where does it belong? It sort of sits out here in a domain that could be accounted for. And the driving impulse of much contemporary philosophy of mind and neuroscience is simply to eliminate it altogether, since it's apparently not a needed addition to our understanding of what knowledge and experience is about. To make up for its own conceptual erasure, in other words, to make up for the fact that the mind, consciousness, interiority was vanishing, so Wilber argues, the modern ego engages in extraordinary nature-dominating agency. To demonstrate its own existence, in other words, the ego sets out to subjugate the material plane, the only domain that supposedly exists. Now, the second problem with the modern quest for transcendence was that the justifiable differentiation between mind and body, mind and brain, as it were, ended up in an unjustifiable dissociation. The rational ego wanted to rise above nature and its own bodily impulses so as to achieve a more universal compassion found nowhere in nature. But it often simply repressed these natural impulses instead, repressed its own biosphere, repressed its own life juices, repressed its own vital roots. This is the impulse behind a lot of the contemporary deep nature, deep green movements to some extent. The ego tended to repress both external nature and internal nature. And this repression, no doubt, would have something to do with the emergence of Sigmund Freud, who arrived exactly at this time to doctor the dissociation of modernity. Now, the Romantic reaction against humanity-nature dualism and against the repression following it was justified to a large extent because something was wrong. Nevertheless, Romantic efforts to heal this rift often went astray because they used competing definitions of nature without clarifying the distinction. Supposedly, modernity had lost touch with the web of life, despite asserting that everything is enclosed and flows within it. Well, I mean, if everything's in it, how can we have lost touch with it? This is the problem. In positing that culture is deviated from nature, the Romantics had to posit a second conception of nature from which humankind can deviate. So Wilbur asks, what's the relation of this nature with a capital N that embraces everything versus this nature with a small n that's different from culture because it's getting ruined by culture? Now, great Romantics such as the German idealist Schelling sought to reconcile this conflict by saying that nature with a big N is spirit, because all-embracing spirit does transcend and include both culture and nature. Most Romantics, however, were committed to the descent path, as were other moderns. Romantics are moderns. They're not pre-modern. They simply identified nature with nature. They identified spirit with sensory nature, in effect. But the closer you get to this nature, to sensory nature, the more egocentric you become. This is a matter of moving back, in a sense, in terms of development. And in search of nature with a capital N, that is the all-encompassing spirit nature, which includes mind and body, interior and exterior, the Romantics headed back to nature with a small n and disappeared into their own selfhood, into a kind of divine egoism, as it sadly turned out. So if Wilbur's right, back to nature fantasies are a reprise of a failed Romantic effort to overcome the humanity-nature split. Instead of moving forward in evolution to the emergence of nature or spirit or world soul that would indeed unify the differentiated mind and body, Romantics simply recommend going back to nature. Such a view invites psychological and social regression. And this involves also calling for us to dismantle culture. If you read the literature that Braun has been reading for years, and some on the part of some deep ecologists and others, there's a tremendous anti-modernist attitude that's deeply troubling. I say this as someone who wrote two books on Heidegger, the second of which had to address his anti-modernity, which was involved with his affiliation with National Socialism. A very painful experience for me. And one reason why my mentor, Ed Ballard, said a philosopher should never publish anything before he's 50, or she's 50, for that matter. Let me move on to this. Now, the restoration of interiority to all phenomena, and this I take it to be the major import of this conference, the restoration of the interior domain, all right, is crucial. In a cosmos in which interiority is assumed to be a near universal feature, human awareness would not be regarded as a weird accident, but rather as a dramatic extension of the interiority everywhere present in terrestrial life and beyond. Now, could we go ahead and put I'm going to give you a model. This is Integral Ecology, the book I'm writing. And I'm going to give you a model of this. Now, this is an intuition. It's a representation. It's a work of art. All right, so you have to understand. It's a metaphor. It's a a trope, etc. I'll call on Larry to help me with this. So I'm not claiming any kind of exact equivalence, but I want to give you a feeling for this. So what is this? This is a mandala from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Gui Samaja mandala, and this is the first stage in representing it. This is the structure of a Vedic altar. Buddhism arose. There's a development out of Hinduism, in perspective. And this would be the outlines of the basic structure of the Vedic altar. Now we could say that this corresponds to the initial, after the Big Bang, the initial development of space-time and the emergence of atomic structures. So we're talking about the earliest stages of development. What's next? Here we are, a later stage in the construction of the mandala, which corresponds to the unfolding of the universe, cosmic evolution. Here we have a lot more in place. Molecules have arisen. The universe has become increasingly complex. The stars have already been through the first generation, and they spewed out their heavy elements as they went into their nova stages. Now we have the basis on planet Earth for the next stage, which is the fully colored mandala. This would be the glorious full-color planet called Earth with all of its life forms on it. And this is what many scientists are attracted to, many environmentalists, including myself. It's the nature in all of its glory. Nature of a certain type. Now, what is missing? This is the next step in understanding the mandala. That is missing. This is an architectural floor plan for a three-dimensional palace, which is that. Now, I'm saying that, so if you look at the mandala, you see again from the top, see these are the palace walls, these are the gates. This is the cosmos, the circle that surrounds it. The mandala is of psychocosmogram, which embraces the entire universe as understood within one of the lineages in Vajrayana Buddhism. But it's a three-dimensional palace. It's not a two-dimensional palace. And what I'm arguing for that this represents is the interiority, you see, which we can't see by looking at the mandala only from those top two dimensions. So no matter how gorgeous the natural world is, and our heart goes out to it in its glory, there's also this dimension to it, not only to us as human beings, but to natural phenomena. They contain this interiority of their own. And this is sensed by and appreciated by earlier peoples with their attitudes of animism and so on, however problematic we find those. There's something to what these people are talking about. This is the basis, it seems to me, for a lot of the kind of things, again, that Braun was talking about. There's that people have a sense about this, that nature is not mere stuff that has no inner dimension. It's akin to us and we to it. It has this extra dimension to it, and if we don't understand that, then we don't really fully understand what we're dealing with. And I think that's one of the things we lost in modernity. And the question is how to bring this back, how to recover this in a way that honors the contributions of modern natural and social science and retains the achievements of modernity, including our appreciation for democracy and all the good things about modernity. Can we pull this off? This, I think, is the big question. Now, I'll just put up here real quickly, because I'm running out of time. This is Wilber's way of mapping this whole thing. You have the exterior and interior dimensions of phenomena, all of which are either individual or collective. And exterior phenomena are approached in this third person point of view from the physical behavioral sciences and the social systemic sciences. And intersubjective second-person phenomena are approached in terms of cultural world space issues. This includes religion and philosophy and literature. Intentional first-person phenomena, that's your own first-person experience, and aesthetic experience and appreciation, as well as the fine arts. You may call these the big three, the domain of it's, the domain of I, and the domain of you, we, as it were. What's that? Interior. I'm missing. It disappeared. That's how small the interior's gotten in our day and time. I'm not going to worry about it. This is what he calls the all-quadrant matrix diagram. This is terrific stuff. I don't have time to go into it. But this is the domain of it's, the social sciences and system sciences, the individual sciences and behavioral sciences, the development that goes on in terms of self from early tribal consciousness all the way up to contemporary and beyond. And these are cultural systems and the belief systems which accompany it. And his claim is that these are all evolving along with each other. That evolution takes place in all four of these domains more or less at the same time. And you can't have one without the other. Let me see what else I've got. 4 perspectives from which to analyze any phenomenon. If you've got some kind of, for example, an animal, you're going to need to analyze it in terms of behavioral and physiological perspectives, in terms of its own social system, in terms of the cultural intersubjective world space of that animal, as well as whatever the first person experience is of the animal. The animal has some kind of little interior domain, probably bigger than we think. And that all those have to be taken into account if you're going to provide the whole picture of what this animal is. These domains have different types of truth claims. I'm just going to move on from here. Now, the amazing thing, of course, is that the entire university system is organized along these lines. The natural sciences, the social sciences and ecosystem sciences, the humanities, and the arts and fine arts, and aesthetics, and so on. Now, if you ever wondered why the university has this organization, it's because somewhere back there, when the universities were organized, everyone took it for granted that these domains of inquiry actually corresponded to some aspect of reality. They weren't just made up. But what's happened is that these domains are really in the saddle, and these domains, as everyone knows who's in a university, these are the ones that don't get any funding. And let's face it, the NEH is not funded like the NIH or the NSF. Let's face it. Let me just end with this because I'm running out of time, and I had this cool thing about Aldo Leopold. Of course, Ron's already done it. Here's what Aldo Leopold had to say. For one species, I quote this, and I got this, in fact, from Gus Dietz-Riga, who's sitting right over here. Thank you for this quote. In fact, I refer to you. Thanks to Gus for this. For one species to mourn the death of another is a new thing under the sun. Did you hear what I said? For one species to mourn the death of another is a new thing under the sun. There's never been a species in the history of the entire planet who was sorry that a species was killed off. But we, who have lost our passenger pigeon, mourn the loss. Had the funeral been ours, the pigeons would hardly have mourned us. Now, this is not to say that we don't have any kinship with a pigeon, for we do. But it does emphasize that there is something special about human beings that needs to be honored and acknowledged if we're going to be serious about doing the work we have to do in order to address the real problems facing us in inhabiting this beautiful planet. So, thank you very much.
Specific questions that relate specifically to what Michael had to say, please ask them now. And then questions that may relate to or correlate with other speakers, we'll say that for the panel.
I've shocked you into submission, evidently. Yes?
Michael, I'd just like to raise the question of Darwin's paper. I'd like to raise the question of Darwin's paper on mourning in non-human animals, because it seems to, at first sight, contradict what you just said, but it also supports what you said earlier about the fact that other animals mourn, and we can recognize their interiority,
right.
Because it echoes exactly what we do when we are bereaved.
Right. Well, I certainly agree. Darwin had strong ethological capacities and was very good at discerning these social behaviors of animals, which he used to infer to, and we do today also, that they have some kind of interiority, and so that we don't come out of nowhere. But what they mourned was they didn't mourn the loss of species. They mourned the loss of their kin. True. I mean, I think of elephants, for example, who seem to have a very rich, emotional, interior life. So there's another order of capacity for mourning, which comes with the cognitive equipment we've got. There's no point in making us humans bad and wrong because we were endowed with this incredible brain. We couldn't help it. I mean, we showed up like this, and it brings with it the capacity we have to do what we're doing today. It really distinguishes us from all the other animals, and if we use that as an excuse then to beat up on these other creatures and destroy the planet we're part of, I mean, this is, I think, a very telling commentary about the limitations of intelligence. And one reason I call for, and as other people in Integral Ecology are doing this work, the restoration of interiority is to appreciate, look, these other creatures, these other beings on this planet, we share with them more than just bodies. They feel from the inside like we do. in their own way. They can take a perspective on things, not like we do. They don't have the fully worked out linguistic capacities that we have, but we are really their kin. And it does raise lots of questions for the problem of giving an adequate characterization to a phenomenon. I mean, this is one of the things that natural scientists or social scientists are really interested in accomplishing. An adequate characterization of the phenomenon with regard to which you're making some kind of hypothesis. Because if you go in with an inadequate characterization, then your hypothesis, no matter what the results you're going to get, are not going to be regarded as very useful because you didn't go in with a good characterization. So if we're trying to understand the complex network or web of life, if you will, on this planet, we're going to have to also acknowledge the fact that it includes interior domains that we have just ignored for a very long time, and that's going to really require stretching on our part. But I think it's a salutary stretching, and it's going to take time. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Yes.
My question is, I think, comes from your last slide, where you had these four divisions of the natural sciences,
right,
social sciences, arts, and humanities. And there was a little box in the middle that had a question mark in it. Mm-hmm. That's the one that interests me most. And could you say what you think is in that box that we actually know?
That would be any issue you want to put out there. When I developed that slide, it was in connection with the book Rising Tide. I don't know if you've read that. It's about the story of the 1927 flood, Mississippi River flood. So thick in the world, it's really a hard time down there, the century. So what I did was to say, look, a key figure in that book was a man named Percy, who was was the son of one of the major landowners along the river in Mississippi, and he played this huge role in this whole saga of the flood and blah blah blah. So I said, let's look at this guy Percy, Alexander Percy. How are we going to understand what this man is about? Well, you could approach this guy Percy from all these different perspectives: neurophysiology, what his body is made of, blah blah blah, all the upper right-hand stuff, as well as behavioral features. You could do it in terms of economic and social factors. It's all he was conditioned by his environment, his economics, work, structure, blah blah blah. You could do it in terms of culture, that is to say, his belief systems, his religion, the types of deep values he held and problematic ones. And you could also do it in terms of his first-person experience. And where would you get that from? Well, his letters, people who remember talking with him, imaginative reconstruction of his point of view, etc. Now, which one of those is going to give us the real Alexander Percy? Well, the problem is that people working from any one of those methods or perspectives are going to tend to say, my perspective is going to give you the real Percy. But what I'm saying is that no, the real Percy is made up of all those different perspectives. And so in an integral ecology, an integrated ecology is one that's going to, if you're dealing with a complex problem, you're going to have to bring in all kinds of different perspectives in order first to characterize the problem, and second, then on the basis of that characterization, to propose solutions to it, which are going to speak to, and this is something I didn't really talk about, people where they're coming from. Let me just read you this one quote. I thought this was terrific. This was written by in a newspaper column by Thomas Friedman. Does anyone know Friedman's work? I mean, I like a lot of the stuff he does. And he had this to say. This is from 2005. He's saying, Friedman argues that environmentalism can be shaken from its current malaise by political leaders who present solutions to major eco-problems in terms consistent with the three major U.S. cultural worldviews. And we argue that these are developmental worldviews that become increasingly integrative. There's a religious or conservative, neocons, these would be liberals in the classic sense, and greens, corresponding to our traditional modern and postmodern categories, religious, neocons, and greens. Urging President George Bush to adopt major eco-friendly energy initiatives, Friedman says that doing so is, quote, smart geopolitics. It's smart fiscal policy. It's smart climate policy. Most of all, it's smart politics. Why aren't we doing this? Even evangelicals are speaking about our need to protect God's green earth. The Republican Party is much greener than George Bush or Dick Cheney, remarked Peter Schwartz, who's chairman of the Global Business Network. Now imagine if George Bush declared that he was getting rid of his limo for an armor-plated Ford Escape hybrid, adopting a geo-green strategy and building an alliance of neocons, evangelicals, and Greens to sustain it. His popularity at home and abroad would soar. That's integrative thinking, appealing to peoples from different perspectives in terms of where they're positioned in order to develop a strategy where a lot of people can get on board. This is going to take being able no longer so closely to identify with any one of these particular developmental stages or positions, including the green. So what I'm proposing is that to be integral, you've got to be post-green, because greens are too identified with their point of view. Yes. Post-green environmentalism. That'll be interesting.
Thank you. All right, bear with me.
Sure.
Okay. So I think this whole idea of interiority is so important. And I think that for me it has a lot to do with accessibility and implementation and actually making this idea of interiority available to the masses, particularly in America. And so I'm thinking as a student that this idea of seeing the interiority in what we live with is also key in seeing the interiority of ourselves as academics and in our own work. Mm-hmm. And I think through what I've seen today is some personalization in our own work, so that not only do we see the interior of what we're studying, but the interior of who's helping us study that. Mm-hmm. And as a student, that to me is really beneficial. And I'm just wondering, you talked about your three modes and that we need to kind of move away and integrate first and second person. Mm-hmm. And how...
Not at the expense of the third person.
Right. And how... would you say that the example that you just read from would be a kind of an example to show us that integration, or
no? What this, and I apologize, I just ran out of time. What this was another feature that I didn't get into in Wilber's model is the idea of the development of consciousness. And his claim is that there are both you've been through development of consciousness from early childhood to now, and there's probably stages to come. And there are people who tend to, for example, how are we to assess the point of view of people who are evangelical Christians in terms of development of spiritual consciousness, political consciousness, and so on? Is green consciousness more inclusive than that? I would say it is. And Wilber would say, how about modern consciousness? For example, there's one reason that moderns are so suspicious of religious traditions is because they tend to be what? Discriminatory. That's what all those horrible wars of religion were about in Europe, which is what gave rise to Enlightenment modernity, the idea of separation of church and state. So moderns wanted to say, hey, look, everyone gets to count. Everyone counts, gets a fair trial. Everyone, regardless of race, creed, blah, 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 all that good stuff. Greens want to integrate more than that. They want to include animals and plants to some extent. They want to be more inclusive. So, but you have then three levels of inclusivity, because religions like Christianity were more inclusive than previous religions. They explicitly wanted to include more. So that was just a brief example of three levels of, say, political consciousness, and how you'd have to develop a rhetorical strategy that would not be cynical, but that would be able to engage people at each of these levels in a way that could get everybody on board the same program.
And are you figuring how to do that?
Well, there are people working on this. In fact, the people in the major environmental groups are quite aware of this issue. And the challenge for them is how to develop a strategy that will do it. Now, the hard part of it is that some of them, and I think about Greens here, you see, they are so... A lot of Greens have a lot of difficulty with moderns and evangelicals. They have a lot of problems, in other words, with industrialists and corporate people, and they have a lot of problems with people who are Christian fundamentalists and so on. So they don't know how to talk to them. They would look down on them, and their rhetorical strategy would fail miserably. So in order to speak to such people effectively, what do you got to do? Get inside that world space. What's it like to be an evangelical Christian? How do things show up for you? Why do things matter? Why do the truth claims you make from within that position make sense? Same thing with moderns. In fact, if you think about it, what could be more wild and free than a free-for-all corporate executive going for the jugular, right? I mean, there's a real powerful example of a human animal, really going after it. Now, we don't like that as Greens, you see, because, wait a minute, this is too... But that's wildness, in a sense. That's got to be admired in some way. In fact, if you compare Dave Foreman and some of these industrialists, they're cut from the same cloth. Individualist, iconoclastic, going for broke, not caring what the establishment thinks, starting the whole thing over again. There's a lot of moderns in both those people.
Thank you.
All right, good. So, yes.
When you say interiority, given your background with Heidegger, when you say interiority and knowing your background with being in the world, Dasein, is this a metaphor? Or is this a Cartesian hangover?
Well, let me put it this way. It's such a good question. Do you know ever heard of this word Umwelt? Umwelt. Now, this is a scientific word developed by a very famous, I think he was Lithuanian, von Uexküll, a biologist in the early 20th century. Heidegger's idea of being in the world, in der Weltsein, was apparently derived from von Uexküll's term Umwelt. So what von Uexküll said was this: look, every organism opens up a space around it, a world within which the things that matter to it can show up. That's its little world. And that the worlds get more and more complicated as the organisms get complicated. So the world of a fly is pretty limited. The world of a frog gets bigger. The world of a big mammal is big. And the world of a human is very big, especially because of language. So Heidegger uses terminology, the clearing, the openness. And another term for that, I think, would be perspective, that we open up a perspective within which phenomena can show up, including the interior phenomena of memory and imagination and cogitation and so on. But this whole domain, you see, we have difficulty talking about this domain. Our ancestors did not have difficulty talking about this domain, because one of the things they spent a lot of time with was the dream world and talking about interior experiences, which we don't talk very much about. Our imagination and mental energy is focused on the exterior world. Imagine in Buddhism, for example, think of the Einsteins of consciousness for 2,000 years who spent time examining the nature of interiority and the relationship with how things show up in the world for them. I mean, that's an incredible history that we have very little knowledge of. It's certainly not taken too seriously in the academy yet. I take it seriously. You know, in my Buddhism course at Tulane, it's a 4-hour course because 1 hour a week we have a meditation lab. It's built in. Imagine getting that to the curriculum committee. But we practice observing the interior phenomena as they show up. That's part of the practice of it. So I think meditation is or analogous kinds of practices, there are many other kinds, are very vital, including religious practices of various kinds, are vital in restoring our experience of our own interiority. And let me just add with this. Have you all noticed the kind of tawdry quality of contemporary popular culture? Has anyone picked up on this? No? Okay, I've kind of noticed it. Well, why do you suppose it's like that? Because our contact with our interior capacities is so diminished that it requires increasing shock value and whatever else just to get a rise out of us. I mean, it's a pathetic commentary on the condition of our society, I think. And another reason why environmentalists need to reach out beyond their usual coterie of companions. I'll end with this. My sermon is over.